They emptied out everything I'd put aside for winter, every split cord of oak, every sack of feed, every jar I had stacked in that cellar with my own 2 hands, and they did it like they were taking out trash from a property they owned. 3 mornings later, their pretty little private lake started shrinking in front of them, slow and ugly, like somebody had pulled a plug under all that money. And the funny part is, there was no plug, no broken pipe, no trout, just one old steel wheel up in the timber, and a man they had decided was too quiet to matter. My name is Wade Mercer. I am 57 years old, and I have lived most of my life on 36 acres outside a small place in western Montana called Briar Fork. Though calling it a town is being generous, it is more like a gas pump, a post office, a church with a crooked bell, and a diner where the coffee tastes like burnt gravel, but everybody still drinks it because it is hot and familiar. My land sits above a newer subdivision called Glasswater Preserve, which sounds like something printed on a brochure by a man wearing loafers with no socks, and honestly, that is about right. They built it about 8 years ago in the basin below my ridge, all black metal roofs, stone driveways, huge windows, outdoor fireplaces, smart sprinklers, imported trees, and one shiny man-made lake sitting right in the middle of it, like God himself had dropped it there for real estate photography. I was there long before any of that. My father was there before me, and his uncle before him, and the land was never easy. But it was honest, which is more than I can say for a lot of people. My place is not pretty in the way theirs is pretty. I have a wood stove that smokes if the wind comes wrong, a generator that needs sweet-talking in January, a barn door that has been rehung 3 times and still hangs like it has opinions, and tools old enough to vote if tools had rights. Their world smells like cedar decking, new leather, and lemon cleaner. Mine smells like pine pitch, cold iron, wet dogs, and diesel. For a long while, we stayed on our sides of things. I did not go down there unless I had to drive past the entrance, and they did not come up here except now and then when somebody got lost following a hiking app that apparently believed private property was more of a suggestion, what they never understood, and what nobody selling those houses bothered to explain, was that the lake they bragged about at dinner parties did not feed itself. The water came from a spring creek that cut through my upper pasture, then down through an old stone diversion wall built in 1952 by my great-uncle Amos, a man who could build anything except a peaceful marriage. That wall had a spill gate, and when the gate was open, the creek fed the channel that ran down into the basin. The same basin Glasswater later dug out, lined, landscaped, lit up, and sold as a lifestyle feature. Back when the first developer came through, my father still had the place, and there was an understanding, not a contract, not a lawyer in sight, just 2 men standing in mud and shaking hands. Water flows. Folks stay respectful. Nobody makes trouble. That was how things used to work around Briar Fork, before people started bringing committees to conversations that only needed manners. The first sign of trouble was small, so small I almost let it slide. I started seeing people on the lower trail, the one that runs along my south fence before it drops through the fir trees. At first it was 1 or 2, then a couple with matching jackets, then a woman pushing one of those strollers built like it was preparing for combat. Then dogs running loose through my brush while their owners stared at their phones. One afternoon, I walked down and found a golden retriever lifting his leg on a stack of cedar posts I had just hauled in. And the owner, a young guy with sunglasses worth more than my chainsaw, smiled at me like we were both enjoying a community moment. I told him, calm as toast, that the trail was private. He looked genuinely confused, not ashamed, not defensive, just puzzled, like I had told him the moon belonged to my cousin. He said, the association map shows this as shared access. I said, the association map is wrong. He said, well, that is what we were told. I said, you were told wrong, and there it was. The first little crack in the piece, because he did not apologize. He just shrugged, called his dog, and walked off like I was an inconvenience placed there by nature. 2 days later, Evelyn Price came up my driveway. Evelyn was the president of the Glasswater Homeowners Board. And even before she introduced herself, I knew she was someone who had spent a lifetime correcting waiters. She was somewhere in her early 60s, silver hair cut sharp under the chin, white blouse, tan coat, boots that looked rugged until you noticed they had never met mud. She drove a pearl-colored SUV so clean I could see my barn reflected in the door, which frankly made the barn look embarrassed. She stepped out, looked around my yard, and smiled in that tight little way people smile when they are trying not to show what they really think. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "I am Evelyn Price, with Blastwater Preserve," I said. "I figured you were not here to buy firewood." Her smile twitched, just a little. She said there had been concerns from residents, concerns about trail access, visual standards, fire safety, unsecured fuel, wood storage, livestock smell, and one complaint, believe it or not, about rooster noise. I told her I did not have a rooster. She said the point remained. That is when I knew this woman did not need facts to feel correct. I leaned on the porch rail and said, "Mum, I am not part of your neighborhood." She had passed me toward my barn, then toward the timber, then back at me and said, "No, but your property directly affects our neighborhood." I remember that line because of the way she said it. Not angry, not loud, just certain, like gravity had asked her for advice. I told her my land was my responsibility and always had been. She said Glasswater had standards to protect property values. I said property values sounded like a terrible religion. She did not laugh. People like Evelyn never laugh when the joke is true. She told me the board would be reviewing the matter, and I told her to enjoy reviewing it from the other side of my gate. For a few weeks, nothing happened. Fall came in, cold and fast, the way it does up there, where one day the hills are gold and the next morning your truck door is frozen shut and you are standing outside with a kettle feeling like a pioneer idiot. I got busy. I split wood until my shoulders ached, stacked it tight in the shed, checked the roof, sealed the cellar door, moved feed bags onto pallets, counted jars, labeled meat, and made sure I had enough to get through a hard winter if the road washed out or the power went down. People from places like Glasswater think preparation is a pantry full of organic crackers and a backup battery for the Wi-Fi. Up on my ridge, preparation is survival wearing work gloves. So when I walked down to the shed one quiet morning in late October and saw the door hanging open, my first thought was not anger. It was confusion, the kind that moves slowly, because your mind refuses to accept what your eyes are handing it. The wood was gone. Not some of it. Not a few rows. Gone. The feed bags were gone. The canned goods I had stored in the side room were gone or smashed, and what had not been hauled off had been burned in a black heap outside the shed. Ash scattered over the frosted ground, twisted lids shining in it like little coins. My fence had been cut clean through. On the post, zip-tied at eye level, was a laminated notice. I pulled it off and read it twice, because sometimes disbelief makes you polite. Hazardous materials removed due to violation of community fire and safety standards. Emergency mitigation authorized under Board Rule 12, signed Evelyn Price, Glasswater Preserve, HOA. I stood there with that paper in my hand, breathing smoke and cold air, and I remember thinking very clearly that a man can lose things and still stay calm. But when someone steals from him and calls it a service, that is when something old and quiet wakes up inside him. I did not drive down there that morning, even though every bone in my body wanted to. I did not storm through their gate, did not bang on Evelyn Price's polished front door, did not give the neighbors a show they could film from behind their curtains and send around with captions like "Unstable rural landowner loses it." I wanted to, believe me. I wanted to bad enough that I had my truck keys in my hand before I even realized I had picked them up. But then I looked back at the shed, at the ash, at the cut fence, at that laminated notice pretending to be law, and something in me cooled down. Anger is useful for splitting wood, not for winning a fight against people who think paperwork makes them holy. So I went inside, set the notice on my kitchen table, made another pot of coffee even though the first one was still sitting cold by the sink, and I sat there for a while listening to my old refrigerator rattle like it was trying to talk sense into me. The strangest part was not the loss, not at first. It was the insult hidden inside the confidence. They had come onto my land with trucks or trailers, cut through my fence, hauled off months of my work, burned what they did not want, and left a note like I ought to thank them for improving the neighborhood. That takes a certain kind of mind, not courage, not stupidity exactly, but the soft arrogance of people who have never been told no by anything they could not call an attorney about. After an hour, I got up and went to the back bedroom where my father used to keep his records in a metal cabinet with a dent in the side from the time I dropped it moving it after he died. Inside were deeds, old tax maps, equipment receipts, letters from people long gone, and a bundle of water papers tied with twine so old it broke when I touched it. I had not looked at those papers in years, mostly because they belonged to a version of my family history that felt settled, the sort of thing you know is there but do not think about unless somebody forces your hand. Well, Evelyn Price had forced my hand. I spread the papers across the table, one by one, and there it was, filed in my great-uncle Amos Mercer's name. Rook Creek Diversion. Right. Established 1952. Beneficial use for pasture. Stock, fire pond. Domestic reserve. Senior priority claim. Now, I am not a lawyer. I've spent more time under broken tractors than inside offices with diplomas on the wall, but I can read plain English when it is sitting in front of me. The creek, the diversion wall, the spill gate, all of it was tied to my parcel. The water feeding their lake had not become theirs just because they dressed it up with stone edging and underwater lights. They had built a dream on a borrowed artery and never bothered to ask whose heartbeat was keeping it alive. I still did not act right away. That matters. I slept badly that night, if you can call it sleep, mostly lying there while the wind tapped branches against the roof and my mind ran through every possible ugly ending. There was a part of me that said, let it go, rebuild, avoid the mess. Because peace has a price, and sometimes a man pays it just to keep his mornings quiet. But there was another part, older and meaner, maybe, that kept asking what happens next if I let this pass. If they can burn your winter stalls today, tomorrow they can demand a path, then a view easement, then a fence moved 10 feet, and maybe they decide your barn is unsightly and your life is an inconvenience. People do not respect a boundary they have crossed without consequence. The next morning, I drove into Briar Fork and stopped at the county records office, which sits behind the courthouse in a brick building that looks like it has been apologizing for itself since 1974. The woman at the counter was named Marlene Voss, and she had known my father, which in a place like that means she knew more about me than most cousins do. She looked over her glasses and said, Wade Mercer, either you need a permit or somebody made you mad. I said, maybe both. She did not smile much. Marlene. But the corner of her mouth moved like it had considered the idea. I laid the papers down and asked her to pull everything connected to Rook Creek, the diversion wall, glass water basin, and any recorded easements or agreements tied to the subdivision. She went quiet then, and when a county clerk goes quiet, you let her work. She typed, pulled folders, walked into a back room, came out with a rolled plat map, then another file with the developer's name on it. And for nearly 40 minutes, the only sound was paper sliding and her keyboard clacking like an old sewing machine. Finally, she leaned back and said, well, I can tell you this much. Your family's water claim is active, senior priority. No abandonment filing, no transfer, no downstream easement recorded to Glasswater Preserve, no maintenance agreement, no access agreement, no purchase of water rights, nothing. I asked her if there was any chance the EHOA rules changed that. She gave me a look so dry it could have started a grass fire. HOA rules do not rewrite state water records. Wait. I almost laughed then. Not because it was funny, but because after the previous day, plain sense sounded like music. She made copies, stamped them, and before I left, she tapped the stack with one finger and said, be careful how you use this. I said, I plan to be, and I meant it. On the way home, I drove past Glasswater's entrance. And for the first time I really looked at it like a thing that could fail. The gate slid open for some white delivery van. Smooth as butter, the sign was set in stone. Glasswater Preserve carved in letters trying very hard to look permanent. Beyond it, the lake flashed blue between rooftops, the centerpiece, the selling point, the mirror they used to admire themselves. I thought about my father standing in the mud decades ago, trusting a handshake, because he believed respect could last longer than ink. Maybe it can. With the right people. With the wrong people, a handshake is just a gap waiting for a lawyer. That afternoon, I walked up to the diversion wall. It sits in a fold of timber where the air is always cooler. Stone laid by hand, moss in the cracks, iron gate wheel half rusted but still solid. The creek came through clear and cold, talking over the rocks like it had no idea rich people were depending on it to keep their patio scenic. I stood there a long time. I thought about the feed. I thought about the smashed jars. I thought about Evelyn's name at the bottom of that notice. Neat and official and bloodless. Then I drove to the state field office in Helena the next day and filed an intent to service and redirect flow for maintenance on a private diversion structure. That is not dramatic, I know. Nobody puts that on a movie poster. But sometimes the most satisfying sentence in the world is the kind that fits on a government form. I attached copies of the water claim, the parcel map, photos of the cut fence, photos of the shed, and that ridiculous HOA notice. The man at the desk, a tired fellow named Ken with a beard full of grey, read the documents twice and said, "You are giving 72 hours notice." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You understand downstream users may be affected." I said, "I imagine they will notice." He looked at me for a moment, then stamped the paperwork and slid my copy back. "Just keep records, Mr. Mercer." I said, "I have started. For 3 days. I did nothing that anyone could see. That might have been the hardest part. I patched the fence enough to keep deer out, cleaned the burned mess slowly, made lists of what had been taken, priced every cord of wood, every pound of feed, every jar, every hour of labor. And at night I sat at the kitchen table building an invoice that grew teeth one line at a time. I included the winter stores. I included repairs. I included disposal. I included 30 years of uncontracted water use at a conservative annual rate, because if they wanted things formal, I was happy to become the most formal man in Montana. By the time the 72 hours were up, I had 2 folders, one for the state, one for Evelyn Price. On the morning of the 4th day, I walked back to the diversion wall before sunrise. Frost silvered the grass. My breath came out white. The iron wheel was cold enough to bite through my gloves. I put both hands on it and paused, not because I felt guilty, exactly, but because I understood this was the line between being wronged and becoming a problem. And then I turned it. At first, it did not want to move. Old iron has a memory. And this gate had been sitting mostly open for years, feeding that basin, feeding those docks, feeding that shining lie down below. I leaned into it slowly, and the wheel groaned, deep and stubborn, like a sleeping animal waking up angry. Then it gave. Inch by inch the gate shifted. The current changed, and the water that had been running toward Glasswater peeled away into the older creek bed, the path it knew before men with brochures started renaming things. It was quiet. That surprised me, even though it should not have. No thunder, no collapse, no big cinematic revenge music rising out of the trees. Just water choosing a different direction because an old mechanism had finally been asked to do what it was built to do. Day 1. Nobody noticed. The lake was still full, the surface still pretty, the fountain still throwing little arcs into the air like nothing in the world was wrong. Day 2. I walked down to a place on my ridge where you can see through the ponderosas, and the edge had pulled back just enough to show a strip of dark mud along the stonework. Not much, maybe a foot, but docks are like pride. They look sturdy until the support starts disappearing. By evening, one of their fountains quit. Day 3. The illusion started to rot in daylight. The water dropped far enough that the decorative rocks looked too high. The shallow end turned brown. 2 paddle boats sat crooked in muck, and the big glass clubhouse reflected more mud than sky. I could hear them by then. Engines, pumps, voices carrying up the hill. Sharp little bursts of panic from people who had confused ownership with control. Around noon, a resident in a tennis visor flagged me down at the lower road and asked if I knew anything about the lake. I told her I was doing maintenance on my water structure. She blinked like I had spoken Latin. She said, "But that is our lake." I said, "Looks like it." I drove on before she could decide whether to be offended. By late afternoon, the phone started ringing. I did not answer. Then came an email from the HOA account with urgent in the subject line. I did not open it until after supper, because urgency travels differently depending on who is bleeding. The message demanded immediate restoration of water flow and threatened legal action, which was a beautiful sentence considering they had signed their own name to trespass and destruction of property. I printed it, put it in the folder, and slept better than I had all week. The next morning, gravel popped under tires outside my house. Fast, careless, expensive tires not made for my road. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee as Evelyn Price's Pearl SUV skidded to a stop in front of the steps, dust rolling around it like a stage curtain. She got out without a polite smile this time. Her hair was still perfect, but her face had lost that boardroom calm. "Wade," she called, already walking toward me. "We need to talk right now." I took one sip of coffee, because timing is one of the few luxuries a poor man can still enjoy, and I said, "Morning, Evelyn. I was wondering when the lake would send you up here." Evelyn stopped at the bottom of my porch steps like she had reached the edge of a courtroom she did not control. And for the first time since I had met her, she looked less like a woman delivering rules and more like a woman discovering gravity applied to her, too. She said, "The lake is dropping. The pumps are failing. Residents are furious, and we have children and elderly people down there dealing with smell, insects, exposed mud, and God knows what else." I said, "That sounds unpleasant." Her eyes narrowed. "Do not play games with me. Wait." I looked out past her SUV toward the ridge, where the wind was moving through the pines, easy as breath, and I said, "Funny. I was thinking the same thing when I found my fence cut and my winter stores burned under your signature." She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again in that careful voice people use when they are trying to step around the truth without touching it. "The board acted under emergency safety authority." I nodded. "Sure, and I acted under recorded water rights." Her face flushed then. "Not much. Just enough to show the blood had finally caught up with the conversation," she said. "You cannot punish an entire community because you have a personal grievance." I set my coffee on the rail and went inside. When I came back, I had the folder in my hand. I held it out to her. She stared at it like it might bite. "What is this?" she asked. I said, "A path back to pretty water." She opened it right there on my driveway, and I watched her eyes move over the pages, the stamped county records, the state notice, the photographs, the inventory, the invoice, the proposed water use agreement. For a few seconds she did not say anything, which was honestly the most agreeable she had ever been. Then she looked up and said, $48,700 for firewood and pantry goods is absurd." I said, "No. Absurd is burning a man's winter supply and leaving him a laminated apology written like a parking ticket. That is replacement cost, labor, fence repair, cleanup, and loss of use." She flicked another page. "And this, 30 years of water fees, is extortion." I smiled a little, not because I was happy, but because sometimes people walk right into the word they should have avoided. "No, Evelyn, extortion is taking something from somebody and threatening them if they ask for it back. This is an invoice for something your community has been enjoying without permission since before half your residents learned how to pronounce rustic." She snapped the folder shut. "Our attorney will destroy this," I said. "Tell him to bring a calculator and boots." She left hard, tires spitting gravel, and by supper I could see flashlights moving around the lake like fireflies having a nervous breakdown. The next day was worse for them. I know that because the whole valley knew it. Briar Fork is small enough that news does not travel. It just appears, usually at the diner before you have put cream in your coffee. By 8 in the morning, old Lenny behind the counter asked me if I had really drained the rich folks' duck pond. I told him it was a maintenance redirection. He said, "Sounds like drained to me," and gave me an extra piece of bacon like I performed a public service. I did not feel like a hero, though that is the part people like to skip. It is easy to tell this story like a revenge fantasy, but when you are the one living it, you do not feel like thunder. You feel tired. You feel the weight of every next step. You wonder if some kid down there is crying because his backyard smells like low tide. You wonder if some family that never heard your name is about to lose equity because their board president wanted to prove a point. And then you remember the ash in your shed and the way your hands shook when you found the broken jars, and you stop apologizing inside your own head. On the 5th day, Evelyn came back with a lawyer. His name was Martin Keene, and he had the soft hands and calm voice of a man who had built people through many disasters. He introduced himself politely, which I appreciated, because manners are free and somehow still rare. He said, "Mr. Mercer, I represent the Glasswater Preserve Homeowners Association, and we would like to resolve this without escalation." I said, "Good. The resolution is in the folder." He gave a small professional smile. "We have reviewed your documents. Your water claim appears valid, and the lack of a recorded agreement is, admittedly, a complication." I said, "That is one word for it." Evelyn crossed her arms. Martin continued, "However, the retroactive fees are excessive, and the current redirection is causing substantial harm to homeowners who were not involved in the removal of your materials." I looked at him, then at Evelyn. Were they involved in giving her power to remove them? Evelyn said, "That is not fair." I said, "Neither is hunger in January." That shut her up. Martin glanced at her, then back at me, and I could see he understood more than she wanted him to. Lawyers get paid to argue, but the good ones know when the hill is already burning. He said, "What would it take to restore flow today?" I said, "Signed agreement. Full compensation for my losses. 5 years prepaid access to the water. Written acknowledgement that no HOA rule applies to my property, and any future access to my land or water structure requires my written permission." Evelyn gave a sharp laugh. "That is outrageous." I looked at her and said, "So is cutting my fence." Martin did not laugh. He asked if restoration would be immediate after payment. I said, "After the first payment clears." I turned the wheel. "Not before." Evelyn stared at me like she was trying to decide whether I was bluffing. But bluffing only works when the other person has something you need. I had already lived without their approval my whole life. They left without shaking my hand. But Martin took the folder with him, and that told me plenty. 2 more days passed. By then the lake looked less like a lake and more like a rich man's mistake. The docks leaned over mud. The fountain pipes stuck out like bones. A blue kayak sat stranded in the middle of a cracked flat, looking embarrassed for everybody. I could hear machinery down there. Pumps whining, men shouting, homeowners holding emergency meetings in linen shirts. The whole beautiful place learning a lesson most ranch kids learn before they are 10. Water is not decoration. Water is life. And life does not care about your brochure. On the 7th morning, I was clearing the last burned debris beside the shed when a single car came up the drive. Not Evelyn's Pearl SUV this time, but a plain grey sedan. She got out alone. No tan coat, no spotless boots. No boardroom armor, just jeans, a sweater, and a face that looked like sleep had avoided her out of principle. She walked up and handed me an envelope. "Full payment for documented damages," she said. "The wire for the 5-year water agreement cleared this morning. Martin sent confirmation." I took the envelope, but did not open it. And the acknowledgement, signed. Board approved, recorded copy pending. I looked at her for a while. She looked back, but not with that old certainty. There was still pride in her. Sure, people do not shed that in a week, but there was something else too, something close to understanding. I said, "Nobody crosses my fence again." She nodded. "Nobody removes anything from my land again." "Yes, nobody sends me one of those little laminated commandments again." Her mouth tightened, and for half a second I thought she might argue, but she only said, "Yes." Then I said, "And if your board forgets this conversation." She finished it for me, quiet as falling snow. "You turn the water off." I nodded. "That is right." She looked down toward the basin, where the lake lay low and exposed, stripped of all its shine. I expected an apology then. Maybe I wanted one more than I admitted, but she did not give it. What she said was, "I thought we were protecting the community." I said, "No, Evelyn, you were protecting the idea that the community owned everything it could see." Matt landed. I saw it land. She gave one short nod, turned, and walked back to her car. I waited until her dust disappeared before I went up to the diversion wall. The creek was running clear in the old bed, happy as it had ever been. Because water does not hold grudges, people do that. I put my hands on the iron wheel again. This time it moved easier, like the old thing remembered me now. Slowly, the gate shifted, the current turned, and the water found the channel back toward Glasswater, sliding downhill through stone and root and shadow, back into the basin that had forgotten where its life came from. There was no cheering, no music, no final speech, just water, moving, steady and patient, doing what water does. A week later, I saw 2 residents walking near the lower trail. They stopped when they reached my fence. One of them raised a hand. I raised mine back. They turned around. That was all I ever wanted. Really, not fear, not worship, just the basic decency of a boundary respected. I rebuilt the shed for winter, smaller, but stronger, and every time I stacked a new row of wood, I thought about how strange justice can feel. It does not always feel clean. Sometimes it feels like mud drying on your boots. Sometimes it feels like winning a fight you wish nobody had started. I would have let that water flow forever for free if they had knocked on my door, asked like neighbors, and treated me like a man instead of an obstacle to their view. But they did not. They made their choice, and I made mine. So I will ask you what I have asked myself more than once since then. Was I right to shut the water off until they paid and signed? Or did I punish too many people for the arrogance of a few? Was that justice? Or was it revenge wearing paperwork? Drop your thoughts in the comments. because from where I stood, that old iron wheel did not create the problem. It only made everybody finally look at it.